When you tap a screen to send a message across the world, you probably imagine your data traveling up, shooting into the sky, bouncing off a satellite, and beaming back down to Earth. It feels logical. It feels modern. But that is a lie. If we turned off every satellite orbiting our planet right now, your GPS would fail and maybe your weather forecast would be wrong. But the internet? The internet would barely blink. Because the internet isn't in the clouds. It is buried deep in the mud, thousands of meters beneath the crushing pressure of the ocean. It travels through physical lines thinner than a garden hose, vulnerable to earthquakes, anchors, and spies. This is the invisible backbone of our civilization, and keeping it alive is the most dangerous engineering challenge on Earth. To understand the scale of this infrastructure, we first have to look at the object itself. If you held a piece of deep-sea internet cable in your hand, you would be underwhelmed. It's surprisingly small, roughly the diameter of a soda can, and in deep waters often as thin as a marker pen. But the engineering inside is a masterclass in protection. It starts with the core, hair-thin strands of glass fiber. This is where the magic happens. Surrounding that glass is a copper tube to carry electricity, then a layer of polycarbonate, then an aluminum water barrier, stranded steel wires for armor, mylar tape, and finally a thick polyethylene coating. Why all these layers? Because at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the water pressure is equivalent to an elephant standing on your thumb. One microscopic crack, one drop of seawater touching that electrified copper, and the line goes dead. Millions of dollars of data silenced in an instant. So how does a Netflix movie or a financial transaction travel through a piece of glass? It's not electricity flowing through a wire. It is light. We use lasers to fire pulses of light into one end of the fiber. Thanks to a principle called total internal reflection, the light bounces off the internal walls of the glass core, zigzagging its way forward without escaping. It travels at nearly the speed of light, roughly 200,000 kilometers per second in glass. But light fades. Even in the purest glass ever manufactured, the signal gets weaker over distance. If you laid a cable from New York to London without help, the signal would vanish long before it reached the mid-Atlantic ridge. This is where the repeaters come in. Every 50 to 100 kilometers, the cable swells into a torpedo-shaped cylinder. These are amplifiers. They take the dying light signal, boost it with fresh energy, and blast it forward to the next stage. These repeaters sit on the ocean floor, powered by thousands of volts of electricity sent from land, functioning flawlessly for 25 years without maintenance. Or at least, that is the plan. Installing these cables is perhaps the most tedious and precise logistics operation in human history. It begins with a survey. Engineers spend months mapping the ocean floor.
It looks like just a smoothed out minor bump, but
Yep.
when you actually get down to brass tacks and get the high resolution data, just fascinating topography.
And that's just simply one of the most fun things about doing the mapping of these seamounts is you have no clue what the surface is going to look like until you map it. And then once you map it, your imagination just goes crazy. It's like being a little child again.
Looking for underwater mountains to avoid and deep ravines to bridge.
Last year, the Oceanus Explorer mapped a little over 20% of the monument and mapped 3 seamounts that had never been mapped before. Just last night, we came upon a seamount that we did not know existed. And these are enormous features. Some of these seamounts that we just recently discovered are over 10,000 feet in height. For those in Hawaii, that's kind of like finding Haleakala that we didn't know existed.
Then comes the ship. These are massive specialized vessels that carry thousands of kilometers of coiled cable in giant tanks called carousels. The laying process can take months. The ship moves at a walking pace, unspooling the cable off the stern. But they don't just drop it. In shallow waters where fishing trawlers and anchors are a constant threat, the cable must be buried. A robotic plow towed behind the ship carves a trench in the seabed, lays the cable, and covers it back up. It's like performing open-heart surgery while dragging a plow across a muddy field, 3,000 meters underwater. Despite all this armor and planning, cables break. And when they do, the internet loves to blame sharks. There is a famous video from years ago showing a shark biting a subsea cable. It went viral. But the truth is, sharks are responsible for less than 1% of cable faults. They realized pretty quickly that fiber optics don't taste very good. The real enemy is us. Fishing nets and dragging ship anchors account for 2/3 of all cable failures. A captain drops anchor during a storm, catches a cable he didn't know was there, and snap. A country's connection slows to a crawl. Then there is nature itself. Undersea landslides and earthquakes can snap multiple cables in seconds.
Last really big earthquake in this area was in 1980, so that this may be a landslide that happened in 1980, which in terms of geological time is like just a flash.
Those earthquakes have a habit of generating landslides, and the fact that we see so many different rock types, both the basalt or the lava from the volcanoes and these ash deposits, suggests that this is more of a catastrophic landslide event that has brought a bunch of material tumbling down the side of the slope.
When the 2011 earthquake hit Japan
is facing its biggest catastrophe since the dawn of the nuclear age, when the U.S. dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And the 2006 earthquake hit Taiwan, they didn't just shake buildings. They severed the data arteries of the entire Pacific Rim. So how do you fix a broken wire at the bottom of the abyss? You can't send a diver. You have to send a repair ship. The ship navigates to the estimated breakpoint. They lower a grapnel, basically a giant hook, and drag it across the seafloor until they snag the cable. They cut it. They pull one end up to the surface, buoy it off, and then go back for the other end. On the deck of the ship, in a sterilized, clean room, technicians splice the glass fibers back together by hand. It is delicate surgical work, performed on a rolling ship in the middle of the ocean. Once the glass is fused and the armor is resealed, they lower the repaired loot back into the water. It is a slow, expensive, and low-tech solution for a high-tech problem. For decades, these cables were owned by consortiums of telecom companies. Verizon, AT&T, British Telecom. They shared the cost and the bandwidth. But in the last 10 years, the game has changed. Now, the biggest cable owners aren't phone companies. They are Google, Meta, Microsoft, and Amazon. They are no longer just renting the roads. They are building their own private highways. Why? Because the cloud isn't just a storage space anymore, it's a global operating system. They need speed, and they need control. This shift has turned the ocean floor into a geopolitical chessboard. Nations worry about who owns the cables, who can tap into them, and who can cut them. In a modern conflict, you don't need to bomb a city to cripple it. You just need to sever a few fiber optic lines entering its coast. We live in a wireless world, but we are tethered to the physical earth more than ever before. Every like, every stream, every email is a pulse of light traveling through a glass thread, resting in the cold, dark mud of the ocean floor. It is a fragile, hidden network that holds our modern world together. So the next time your internet loads instantly, don't look up at the sky. Look down at the ocean. That's where the magic is.
If you want more small things with big reasons, subscribe.